Buenas tardes. Abans de començar, m'agradaria donar les gràcies al Museu de la Ciència i de la Tècnica de Catalunya i a la Gràcia d'Orel Ferrer per convidar-me. M'agradaria també demanar disculpes per no parlar català. Gracias. I have tried to translate a few of my titles. Please take this as a sign of respect, if not as an understandable form of communication. So, well, as it is one of the last, my presentation is condemned to repeat a lot of what we've heard yesterday and today. So I do hope that I will not bore you to death. Please take this as a synthesis, and yet not a very original one. Oh, gracias. So my presentation will focus, as its title says, on company towns. Surprise. I will define those in a minute. On company towns and on the concept designated in French by the word urbanisme, that is in English by the terms urban planning or town planning, as it was called earlier in the 20th century. In English, there is no single word equivalent to urbanisme or urbanismo, or I think it's urbanisme in Catalan. However, the reference to the French urbanisme or the Catalan urbanisme is important here, especially since we're having this discussion in English, where urbanism designates above all the, quote, the character of life in the cities, unquote. That is, in other words, what in French we would call or term urbanité. So let's just say here that I will not be addressing urbanité or urbanism, nor the character of life in the cities, but rather how this character is produced, how it is produced, and how it has been produced, in particular throughout the 20th century in company towns, which is precisely the context in which urban planning expanded. Yesterday, we looked at factory towns as system. I will look at them as historical subjects in a history of urban planning that needs to be written. In this regard, company towns are a universe that is yet to be explored. You can see them here, well, at least approximately 1,200 of them, and there are a lot missing there. As you know, they have characterized those regions in the world that developed with industrialization and those regions where industrialization required the buildings of cities or at least of towns, company towns as self-sufficient, delimited in space entities. Those company towns became established with the flow of ideas supported by the expansion of multinational companies and the organization and diversification of 20th century industrial capitalism. Some of these towns, you know, that have been extensively studied in books and articles, and the social conditions that characterize them have been screened in detail. But they have seldom been considered together in relation with each other or as a coherent whole. This, however, is probably more possible now thanks to technology and because data is now available. Just think of the thousands of archives that we can access now on the internet and that we are increasingly able to represent using deep mapping, for example, in the larger context of social humanities. You obviously all know such company towns as the ones I'm showing you, 3 of them here, that are on the World Heritage List. Actually, 4 out of 12 towns related to industry have been inscribed with the designation company town. They were all inscribed under criterion 2 that requires, as you know, open quote, to exhibit an important interchange of human values over a span of time or within a cultural area of the world, etc. You also know that this is both insufficient and poorly adapted to developing our knowledge and to the recognition of these towns. It is no secret that this criterion too is the catch-all category. And it has also been noted that the focus of the inscription of company towns in that manner is placed much more often on factories or on society than on the built environment. Housing is mentioned at the best, but the planned settlement is mainly left aside. Company towns are the ghosts of the history of urban planning. They haunt it, but they remain unseen. So what do I mean then by company town? It is a town that is therefore an entity that can be larger and more composite than a workers' village, and which designates the built environment rather than its inhabitants, that is the workers. A company town is a planned industrial town created at the behest of a mother company, at the behest of a mother entity, as a place of production. I will not insist here on the typologies of workers' villages or factory towns or others. Let's just say that company town covers well what I will be discussing, which could as well include Ural towns or the socialist cities that we just saw, and even some Danwei Sushe in China. One of the advantages of the term company town is the fact that it includes the notion of a new town, which would have been created by the company. That could also be a government agency or any creating body. A new town created together with the plant or the factory. Hence, I guess company town allows us to focus on the town, the created or planned town, and less on the workers or on the factory. Of course, company town is similar to impressionistic in painting in as much as it is traditionally pejorative. Company towns are perceived as places of misery and are even associated nowadays with ghost towns. As a result, company town evoked the idea of abandonment, of end-of-the-world destruction. I'm sure you have all such images in mind, as we saw some yesterday and just today. I'm bringing you more here as Val-Jalbert in northern Quebec. This has become a touristic site, actually. But you could also think of Wittenoom, former and doomed asbestos town in Australia. These are the sole inhabitants of today Wittenoom. And this is back in Canada, the sole inhabitant of Ayoko today, as the company sold the site for a real estate development. Some other former company towns do not experience such a glorious end, such as Sparrows Point in the United States, which was, for its part, reduced to ashes by its mother company. This is a strong motivation behind my investigation into company towns. That is, to learn something before a second wave of deindustrialization removes even more of their traces. So what I would like to address today are these traces, this heritage, as well as the issues surrounding the recognition of company towns, and why not, to envision this heritage as a necessary and helpful recognition of the social legacy of company towns. To that end, I will use the example of World Heritage and draw your attention to the underutilized and poorly applied criterion 1, that is, open quote, to represent a masterpiece of human creative genius. This small phrase holds significant meaning. It refers to masterpiece, a masterpiece being a work of art that approaches perfection. Actually, in 1980, the original definition of this criterion referred explicitly to artistic contribution. Of course, Art here refers to the definition inherited from the fine arts tradition. The fine arts are the beaux-arts tradition, which flourished at the close of the 19th century. The fine arts tradition that included three arts: painting, sculpture, and architecture. Now, is there a reason why this definition of art, which has since integrated music, literature, theater, dance, cinema, photography, and even gastronomy, is there any reason why these arts should not extend to urban planning, also born in the 20th century? I see none, especially if the idea here is to focus, as stated, to focus on human creative genius. I will explain that in a moment. For now, let's see that on the World Heritage List, 37 of the elements considered as cities and 6 cultural landscapes are inscribed under Criterion 1. That is, they are said to, quote, represent a masterpiece of human creative genius. Aside from 2 notable examples, these 43 cities or landscapes are all historic towns or old towns, sometimes predating industrialization by several centuries. In fact, if we were to look at urban planning from a historical perspective, only the city of Brasilia seems to fit Criterion 1, and that is not in the industrial sphere. Furthermore, as regards urban planning, the inscription of Brasilia under Criterion 1 was justified, as you can see here. Brasilia is a singular artistic achievement, a prime creation of the human genius, representing on an urban scale the living expression of the principles and ideals advanced by the modernist movement and effectively embodied in the tropics through the urban and architectural planning of Lucio Costa and Oscar Niemeyer. The Brazilian experience is notable for the grandiosity of the project, etc. Now here, the notion of creation in relation to a settlement is reduced to only 2 parameters. One is mere form in the terms of the aesthetic of buildings and the grandiosity of the project. And the other is the relationship to a movement, mainly by virtue of architecture, as well to a blatant objectification of the creators that lend credence to the creation according to the tradition instituted by the Beaux-Arts, the fine arts. That means that the definition of urban planning also needs to be reviewed, and in the process, we need to go beyond present labels and paradigms, especially as it also appears that company towns can be used to redefine that heuristic category of urban planning on a scientific level, and hence, company towns can help us to better understand 20th century urban planning in relationship to the territory. This, in turn, would allow to fully recognize company towns. Of course, a large number of urban planners, especially in the 3rd quarter of the 20th century, planners have themselves taught us to view urbanism, to view urban planning otherwise. How many textbooks claim that, quote, urban planning does not create, it manages? And yet, painters have tools that they use to create art. They have brushes, they have perspective, colors, and geometry, for example. Urban planners, and they can be architects, they can be engineers, and what say you? Urban planners have landscape, land organization, habitat, access to property, building economy, and development control, for example, that are created with buildings, with plots, with streets, with transportation, with zoning, etc. And in this perspective, company towns throughout the 20th century have been a genuine field school for urban planning. The plans of dozens of company towns figure prominently in hundreds of journals and dozens of manuals. They are everywhere. My cat loves those manuals. International competitions have been organized all over the world in order to implement some of these company towns. Now, why should they be ignored in contrast to international architecture competitions? Obviously, in order to comprehend this, we need to redefine urban planning so as to identify the masterpieces thereof. A picture is worth 1,000 words, they say. So, I was saying that artists make paintings, architects create buildings, they create them in space. Urban planners create places. I'm not sure that that distinction can be made in such a way in Catalan. Anyway, David Bodenhammer has provided that definition of place, which I find useful. Place as a meaningful location with three distinct attributes: location, that is fixed coordinates; locale, that is the material and visual space associated with location or its setting; and a sense of place, the historical and emotional characteristics tied to a defined space. Urban planning has traditionally been associated with the first of these, that is location. Let's consider all three, because this is precisely what 20th century urban planning did, and specifically in company towns. Urban planning created meaningful location, substrates within which workers rooted themselves, where it made sense to embody utopia as we have seen yesterday as well as today, and substrates in which the industrial society became rooted as well. Urban planning has always been about placemaking, even before the term officially came to existence. Many of the maps and plans that we saw yesterday testify to this. Indeed, if we are to examine literature on company towns beyond a certain Marxist historiography, we find hundreds of accounts highlighting such a branded identity. Company towns are always said to be the best, the largest, the most modern. Quite a lot of them are called model at some point. They have the best gyms, they have the biggest pools, they have the first golf courses, and of course, they have the first cinemas. I actually know of 2 towns in Canada which are both said to have had the first cinema in the history of Canada. They sure got their way into building civic pride, and that is surely one of the contributions of urban planning as an art is in company towns. Beyond such representations, we briefly saw this example of Margaret and Höhe yesterday. Beyond these such representations, the fact is that many of these company towns, in particular those that were planned in areas targeted for resources exploitation, many of these company towns, and as Rosa Serrarotes demonstrated yesterday, I think, many of these company towns were specifically created to draw families in order to sustain an increasingly skilled labor force, and not only to house workers. That turned these company towns into genuine society projects, where the goal of urban planning was, above all, to create a feeling of belonging and thus create civic pride. In so doing, and this is an understatement, in so doing, company towns supported the development of ways of living in light of capitalism that goes way beyond the paternalism with which they are so often associated. They constitute works of urban planning, as you would say, of works of art. Now, let's wander through a few indicators that could help us decipher such creations of a meaningful environment through planning. Urban planning is not only garden city, city beautiful, and so forth. It can use symbols, forms, and even spaces, circulation, and functions that can transform the meaning of the environment. Thus, the monumental becomes symbolic as a sign of great quality and even as a sign of wealth in a mining town. The order of a landscape can testify to a revolutionary and exclusive modernity, as is the case here in beautiful Bois-du-Luc, or as is the case in Yon-Soleil. You can find planted boulevards, landplaces, in company towns in Canada, as you would find them in old and beautiful cities. Why? To make the place desirable. Company towns have to be desirable place to live in. So they are laboratories in creating desirable and meaningful places. I will not be delving into a psychological analysis of place, but I would nevertheless like to note a number of features that make it up and that company towns benchmarked because they were numerous, because they provided the necessary means, and because the desirability of place was required for the industry's success. That is why you will find this masterpiece of modern landscape in Cabramurra, Australia, and not just a work camp. So what does it do to consider urban planning as an art, as a creation, and thus to consider company towns as potential masterpieces of this art? It makes us look differently at the heritage of company towns, not just housing, not just plants and shafts and so on, to look at them as places and to decipher what, in the creative gesture of planners, what gives it its meaning, its identity as a place. So how can we inquire on company towns as works of art of urban planning? We can access the urban forms, the tangible ones as sidewalks or perspectives or landscapes, or the intangible ones as bylaws, covenants, growth control schemes. We can access urban forms such as these, and we can access them as they were historically created and follow them through space and time to grasp and understand that creation in its context. We saw a lot of this with Monica Ferrari this morning, and I will not go further into it considering the time is running, but we can discuss this afterward. Let's just briefly surf through a few examples. Before that, we have to note that this, of course, also warrants that we cease to look at town plans as though they were pictures or mere structures, and that we recognize that these features for what they are, spaces with a designed capacity to engender living environments, spaces that became places as a result of a creative work conveyed by the drawings and plans that mark the difference between traditional know-how and the act of creation, but deployed in the lived, perceived, and appropriated environment. Street patterns that are also circulations and not mere circles or grids. Street patterns define their users and qualify the space that they mark. Pathways for pedestrian only, for example, and hence set aside for residents. Living in an everyday life thus becomes the primary functions of such works of urban planning, as you can see here in Kirimat in northwest Canada, or in Baden, several thousand of kilometers to the southeast in North Carolina. And if you were to look, actually, you could also find such patterns in the writings of the French architect and planner Tony Garnier, who might have something to do with the planning of this Baden town, but that is beyond my scope here. Street patterns are, of course, a byproduct of ground organization and land use, which constitute the junction between physical geography and the inhabited space by way, for example, of park systems, as what you can see here in Karratha. They define neighborhoods and their surroundings. In other words, they define the living environment, its landscape, and what it contains. Street patterns are just a sign of the junction between the location, the locale, and the sense of place. They wrap the imagined place around the contour of its setting. And this is, as we will see with habitat, this is one of the main features of many company towns, to look as if they have always been there, or at the least as if they belong there. even though what we see at first glance are only nice parks with nice neighborhoods units, as we can see here in Fort McMurray. Ground organization obviously also consists from street pattern up, as they used to say in the 1920s. It also consists of the work done on the landscape and its components, the streets, facades, vegetation, topography, infrastructure, and even its functions beyond zoning. This work defines public space and its character, which may be, for example, commercial and monumental, or commercial and convivial, especially with inner streets that replace the neoclassical monumentality around World War II, be it in Denmark, as you can see here, or in Kirimat, again in Canada. Of course, ground organization is also responsible for the infamous segregation that is intertwined with the historiography of company towns, and which can go so far as to define individuals and their relationship to their environment, as South Hedland here in Australia is an, although recent, very prominent example. However, we still need to discuss what the segregation targets, why, and by virtue of what constraints, as history has showed that it cannot systematically be credited to some bad company. So stating that a company town is or has been segregated does not say a lot, neither on the reasons nor on the means. And again, looking at the urban plan, including the property titles, zoning, and underlying forms that it contains, looking at the urban plan might help us to deal with the creation that was hence put together. Then we can see that some social segregation was just installed as groups of houses were rented to temporary high-qualified staff instead of being sold to regular employees who were favored in that way. But you already know that this is common in company towns. As a matter of fact, in company towns, urban planning also determined what was or could be a home, and not merely housing. It did that through an array of methods and formulas for inhabiting spaces scattered across the planet, but that have all supported the rise of the middle class through the dissemination of what would be its favorite, I should say its ideal, the single family house, the cottage, that went from Schio or Crespidada in Italy to Corner Brook in eastern Canada, or Roanoke Rapids in North Carolina, and Powell River, where, as in many places, we discovered that company town planning included introducing into new dwelling places old customs that became deeply cultural, such as single-family home duplexes here in Powell River, modern cottages and row houses, or even traditional ways of living together with traditional ways of building in new houses, such as this neo-vernacular housing to be found in Arvida, Canada. David Bodenhammer, whom I was referring to previously, wrote, open quote, "Time gives specificity to space. The association with the past creates the particularity that space requires to become place. And company towns have been at the forefront of such processes of identity recreation." This explains all these historic figures that we find from Ohio here to Birmingham. We saw that this morning, that there is also much to be learned from the circulation of models if only we examine company towns as embodiment of a history of urban planning which is yet to be written. We could then highlight original contributions such as building log homes to house the workers of a gold mine in reference to the lumber industry past of the region and as a symbol of the modernity of the new industry, giving houses where the former lumber activity would only build camps. In 1915, Patrick Geddes, who is often cited as one of the fathers of modern town planning, Patrick Geddes asked the question, what is to be our relation to practical life? And it was in fact urban planners who, and that was largely in company towns, urban planners who created the interface between the need for new towns and the often rebellious materiality of their erection. Building in metal against termites in Australia, designing cities to serve as a wall against the cold in northern Quebec. It is also to urban planning that we have to credit imagining property funding schemes that would permit every individual to settle. Workers started becoming landowners long before the mid-20th century, and at least in all North America. It is in company towns, in the aftermath of First World War, that we can find the precursors of government housing and home ownership programs. This is what you see here, portrayed in the town of Alcoa in Tennessee in 1919, where both white and black workers were encouraged to buy their homes. It is also the urban planning of company towns that conceived of and put in place some original conditions necessary for the implementation and sustainability of cities. For example, by providing free housing to workers, as here in Ybor City, free housing that would in turn provide clientele to future retailers who would thus be attracted to buy plots downtown. These transactions would financially support the building and the maintenance of the workers' housing, while creating a cost-effective town center, which, as you can see here, is still thriving today. That, too, is placemaking. Operational planning also involves the construction of the town itself. For example, managing the construction of thousands of units simultaneously and as fast as required by industry production and as robustly as needed to enhance industry sustainability. Here in Oak Ridge, the Manhattan Project boasted the population from a mere 3,000 to 75,000 in just 3 years, from 1942 to 1945. And it is also urban planning that is responsible for growth control and that preserved those company towns that still surround us nowadays, notably by continuously accommodating new uses and new growth to the original creation. This is how former bungalows in Karatha now become townhouses, which occupy less lot space without impacting on the urban scheme or on the landscape created previously. There, the experience of former company towns nourish new company towns, at least when the industry doesn't give into the fly-in, fly-out, no-place mode. It is also urban planning, and we saw this morning too, it is also urban planning, which is also planning legislation that designs what is heritage and how it can be preserved, especially if we go beyond monuments to think about urban fabric, to think about the places that I have shown. In some cases, of course, urban planning is outrun by the industrialization, as is the case here. We're back in Ayoko. But in other cases, it works as a place creation all over again, together with civic pride, land use, etc., that make space become place. Industrial society projects that become heritage society projects through the urban planning that brings them to life. So these are just a few examples of how urban forms can speak of their creation if we encourage them. And we can then question them on their legacy, on how they measure as masterpieces, or just simply how they contribute to the industrial and post-industrial civilization through their own art. I'll conclude with that, because it goes without saying that what I've showed to you here are not all examples of World Heritage. You will have understood that World Heritage here was also a pretext to try to open a new access to knowledge of the world and maybe bring to light what seems to me a blind spot in industrial heritage as well as in the history of urban planning. A blind spot, I think, in our understanding of how we experience territory, and maybe even more, a blind spot in our understanding of human creativity. I think that this is a legacy of workers' villages, factory towns, and company towns that we should at least consider, if not only to add to this map all the missing dots and blind spots that it reveals. Thank you. Gracias.